Then he looked up and saw a woman standing by the table. She was skinny like Elmira and had stringy black hair. "Let's get going, cowboy," she said. "You can't do nothing sitting there." "Get going where?" he asked, taken by surprise. No one had ever called him cowboy before, but it was a natural mistake. He had taken off his sheriff's star for a few days, a precaution he often took in a strange town. "I'm Jenny," she said. "Sam said you were looking for me. Or have I got the wrong cowboy?" "Oh," July said, embarrassed. He had even forgotten he was waiting for someone named Jenny. "We could get going even if you ain't the right cowboy," Jenny said. "If you can afford that much whiskey, you can afford me. You could even buy me a drink if you felt polite." July had never in his life bought a woman a drink, or even sat with a woman who liked to drink. Any other time, such an invitation would have shocked him. But in this case, it just made him feel that his manners weren't all they should be. Jenny had huge brown eyes, too large for her thin face. She was looking at him impatiently. "Yes, have a drink," he said. "I'm running up a bill." Jenny sat down and waved at the bartender, who immediately appeared with a bottle. "This one's drinking like a fish," he said cheerfully. "I guess it's been a long, dry trail." July suddenly remembered why he was waiting to see the girl named Jenny. "Did you know Ellie?" he asked. "I heard you knowed her." It was Jenny's turn to be surprised. Elmira had been her best friend for 3 years, and she hardly expected a drunken young cowboy to mention her name. "You mean Ellie Timms?" she asked. "Yes," July said, "that's the Ellie. I was hoping you had news of her. I don't know where she is." "Well, she moved to Missouri," Jenny said. "Then we heard she married a sheriff from Arkansas, but I didn't put no stock in that kind of rumor. I can't imagine Ellie staying married to no sheriff." "She didn't," July said. "She run off while I was chasing Jake Spoon, and I got 3 people killed since I started looking for her." Jenny looked at the young man more closely. She had noticed right off that he was drunk, but drunks were an everyday sight, and she had not looked close. The man seemed very young, which is why she had taken him for a cowboy. They were mostly just boys. But this man didn't have the look of a cowboy once she looked close. He had a solemn face and sad eyes, the saddest she had looked into for a while. On the basis of the eyes, he was an unlikely man for Ellie to have married. Ellie liked her laughs, but then people often did unlikely things. "Are you a sheriff?" she asked, sipping the whiskey Sam had poured. "I was," July said. "I'm most likely going to have to give it up." "Why do that?" Jenny asked. "I ain't a good fighter," July said. "I can crack a drunk on the head and get him to jail, but I ain't really a good fighter. When we rode into that camp, the man with me killed 6 or 7 men, and I never killed a one. I went off and left Roscoe and the others, and they got killed before I could get back. It was only Jake Spoon I went to catch, but I made a mess of it. I don't want to be a sheriff now." He had not expected such words to rush out. He had suddenly lost control of his speech somehow. Jenny had not expected it either. She sipped her whiskey and watched him. "They say Ellie left on a whiskey boat," July said. "I don't know why she would have done it, but that's what they say. Roscoe thought a bear might have got her, but they didn't see no tracks." "What's your name?" Jenny asked. "July Johnson," he said, glad that she was no longer looking at him quite so impatiently. "It sounds like Ellie to me," Jenny said. "When Ellie gets enough of a place, she jumps in the first wagon and goes. I remember when she went to Abilene, I didn't have no idea she was even thinking of leaving. And then, before it was even time to go to work, she had paid some mule skinners to take her, and she was gone." "I got to find her," July said simply. "You come to the wrong town, mister," Jenny said. "She ain't in Dodge." "Well, then I'll have to keep looking," July said. He thought of the empty plains, which it seemed to him he had been lucky to get across. There seemed only the smallest chance that Ellie would have been so lucky. "I fear she's dead," he said. "She's hunting Dee, I'd say," Jenny said. "Did you know Dee?" "Why, no," July said. "I was told he died of smallpox." Jenny chuckled. "Dee ain't dead," she said. "He's in Ogallala. There's a gambler sitting right over there who seen him not 2 months ago." "Where?" July asked, and Jenny pointed to a pudgy man in a white shirt and a black coat who sat alone at a table shuffling cards. "That's Webster Witter," Jenny said. "He keeps up with D. Boot. I used to, but I quit." "Why?" July asked. He sensed that it was a rather loose-tongued question, but the fact was his tongue was out of control and behaving ever more loosely. "It's like trying to keep up with a tumbleweed," Jenny said. "D wears out one town, and then he's off to another. I ain't that way. I like to settle in. I've been here in Dodge 5 years already, and I guess this is where I'll stay." "I don't know why she married me," July said. "I ain't got any idea about it." Jenny looked at him for a bit. "Do you always drink like this?" she asked. "No, I seldom drink," July said, "though I do like toddy in the winter." Jenny looked at him a while. "You ought to stop worrying about Ellie, mister," she said. "No man's ever been able to stop Ellie for long, not even Dee." "She married me," July said. He felt he had to insist on that point. "Well, I married Dee once myself," Jenny said. "I just did it because he was good-looking. That and the fact that I was mad at somebody else. Ellie and me are a lot alike," she added. July just looked at her sadly. Jenny sighed. She had not expected to encounter such misery in the middle of the afternoon. "You're right good-looking," she said. "I expect that explains it. If I were you, I'd start getting over it." "I got to find her," July said. "I got to tell her about little Joe. He got killed on the Canadian." "She oughtn't to had him," Jenny said. "I told her not to. I wouldn't have one for anything. I've had offers, too." July drank 2 more whiskeys, but had little more to say. "Well, the bar's getting rich, but I ain't," Jenny said. "Don't you want a little fun to take your mind off it?" It seemed to July that he was not so much sitting in the chair as floating in it. The world seemed kind of watery to him, but it was all right because he was easily able to float. Jenny giggled, looking at him. "You sure are drunk, Mr. Johnson," she said. "Let's go have a little fun. I always liked stealing Ellie's boys, and here I've got a chance to steal her husband." The way she giggled made July feel happy suddenly. He had not heard a woman giggle in a long time. Ellie never giggled. So he got up and followed Jenny up the stairs, walking carefully so as not to embarrass himself. He got upstairs all right, but before they could get to Jenny's room, he began to feel wrong. His stomach began to float higher than he was. It began to float right out of his mouth. Jenny had kept a close eye on him, and she quickly guided him to the outside stairs. July knelt down on the little landing and vomited over the edge. The next thing he knew, he was lying flat on the landing, still vomiting. From time to time he quit vomiting and just lay there, but then he would start again, his body heaving upward like a bucking horse. He held to the rail of the landing with one hand so he wouldn't accidentally heave himself over. It was a bright day, the Kansas sun beating down, but July felt like he was in darkness. Cowboys rode up and down the street below him. Once in a while one would hear him vomiting and look up and laugh. Wagons went by, and the drivers didn't even look up. Once, while he was resting, 2 cowboys stopped and looked at him. "I guess we ought to rope him and drag him to the graveyard," one said. "He looks dead to me." "Hell, I wish all I had to do was lay on them stairs and vomit," the other cowboy said. "It beats loading them longhorns." July lay face down for a long time. The heaves finally diminished, but from time to time he raised his head and spat over the edge to clear his throat. It was nearly sundown before he felt like sitting up, and then it was only to sit with his back against the building. He was high enough that he could see over the main street and the cattle pens, and west to where the sun was setting, far off on the plain. It was setting behind a large herd of cattle being held a mile or 2 from town. There were thousands of cattle, but only a few cowboys holding them. He could see the other cowboys racing for town. The dust their running horses kicked up was turned golden by the sun. No doubt they were just off the trail and couldn't wait for a taste of Dodge, the very taste he had just vomited up. The last sunlight filtered through the settling dust behind the cowboys' horses. July sat where he was until the afterglow was just a pale line on the western horizon. The white moon shone on the railroad ties that snaked out of town to the east. He felt too weak to stand up, and he sat listening to the sounds of laughter that came from the saloon behind him. When he finally stood up, he was indecisive. He didn't know if he should go in and thank Jenny, or just slip away and continue the search for Elmira. He had an urge to just ride on out into the dark country. He didn't feel right in a town anymore. The crowds of happy cowboys just made him feel more lonesome somehow. On the plains, with nobody in sight, he wasn't reminded so often of how cut off he felt. He decided, though, that politeness required him to at least say goodbye to Jenny. As he stepped back in the door, a cowboy came out of her room, looking cheerful, and went clumping down the stairs. A moment later, Jenny came out, too. She didn't notice July standing there. To his astonishment, she stopped and lifted her skirts, so that he saw her thin legs and more. There was a smear of something on one thigh, and she hastily wet her fingers with a little spit and wiped it off. Just then she noticed July, who wished he had not bothered to come through the door. He had never seen a woman do such an intimate thing, and the shock was so strong he thought his stomach might float up again. When Jenny saw him, she was not very embarrassed. She giggled again and lowered her skirts. "Well, you got a free look, but I won't count it," she said. "I guess you didn't die." "No," July said. Jenny looked closely at him as if to make sure he was all right. She had a poor complexion, but he liked her frank brown eyes. "What about the fun?" she said. "You lost out this afternoon." "Oh," July said, "I'm not much fun." "I guess you wouldn't be after vomiting up your stomach," Jenny said. "I can't wait, though, mister. 3 herds came in today, and there's a line of cowboys waiting to fall in love with me." She looked down the stairs. The noise from the saloon was loud. "It's what I did with Ellie," July said. Meeting her friend Jenny had made his life clearer to him suddenly. He was as simple as the cowboys. He had fallen in love with a whore. Jenny looked at him a moment. She had come out of her room briskly, prepared for more business, but something in July's eyes slowed her down. She had never seen eyes with so much sadness in them. To look at him made her heart drop a little. "Ellie was tired of this business," she said. "It was the buffalo hunters made her decide to quit. I guess you just come along at the right time." "Yes," July said. They were silent, looking at one another, Jenny reluctant to go down into the well of noise, July not ready to go out the door and head for the livery stable. "Don't you want to quit?" he asked. "Why? Are you going to fall in love with me, too?" Jenny asked in her frank way. July knew he could if he wasn't careful. He was so lonely, and he didn't have much control. "Don't you want to quit?" he asked again. Jenny shook her head. "I like to see the boys coming in," she said. "People are always coming in here in Dodge. The cowboys are nicer than the buffalo hunters, but even the buffalo hunters was people." She thought a moment. "I couldn't sit around in a house all day," she said. "If someone was ever to marry me, I expect I'd run off, too. The time I get blue is the winter. There ain't no people coming in." July thought of Ellie sitting in the cabin loft all day, dangling her legs. No people came in at all except him and Joe, and Roscoe once in a while when they caught a catfish. Hearing Jenny talk put his life with Ellie in a very different light. "You ought to go on back home," Jenny said. "Even if you catch her, it won't do no good." July feared it wouldn't, but he didn't want to go back. He just stood there. Something in his manner made Jenny suddenly impatient. "I got to go," she said. "If you ever do find Ellie, tell her I still got that blue dress she gave me. If she ever wants it back, she'll have to write." July nodded. Jenny gave him a final look, half pitying, half exasperated, and hurried on down the stairs. July felt sad when she left. He had the feeling that an opportunity had been missed, though he didn't know what kind of opportunity. The streets were full of cowboys going from one saloon to the next. There were horses tied to every hitch rail. He went to the livery stable and saddled his new horse. The old man who ran the stable was sitting with his back against a barrel of horseshoe nails, drinking now and then from a jug he had between his legs. July paid him, but the old man didn't stand up. "Which outfit are you with?" the old man asked. "I'm with myself," July said. "Oh," the man said, "a small outfit. This is a funny time of night to be starting out, ain't it?" "I guess it is," July said, but he started anyway. Chapter 70. Once they got west, beyond the line of the grasshopper plague, the herd found good grass. The skies stayed clear for nearly 2 weeks, and the drive went the smoothest it had gone. The cattle settled down and moved north toward the Arkansas without stampedes or other incidents except for one, a freak accident that cost Newt his favorite horse, Mouse. Newt wasn't even riding Mouse when the accident occurred. He had traded mounts for the day with Ben Rainey. The day's work was over, and Ben had ridden into the herd with Call's permission to cut out a beef for the cook. He rode up to a little brindled cow, meaning to take her yearling calf, and while he was easing the calf away from her, the cow turned mean suddenly and hooked Mouse right back of the girth. She was a small cow with unusually sharp horns, and her thrust was so violent that Mouse's hindquarters were lifted off the ground. Ben Rainey was thrown and had to scramble to keep from being hooked himself. Soupy Jones saw it happen. He loped in and soon turned the mad cow, but the damage was done. Mouse was spurting blood like a fountain from his abdomen. "Get Dietz," Soupy said. Dietz was the best horse doctor in the outfit, though Pocampo was also good. Both men came over to look at the wound, and both shook their heads. Newt, on the other side of the herd, saw people waving at him and loped over. When he saw Mouse gushing blood, he felt faint from the shock. "I don't know what went wrong with her," Ben Rainey said, feeling guilty. "I wasn't doing nothing to her. She just hooked the horse. Next thing I knew, she was after me. She has them little sharp, twisty horns." Mouse's hind legs were quivering. "Well, you better put him down," Call said, looking at Newt. "He's finished." Newt was about to take the reins when Dish Boggett intervened. "Oh, now, Captain," he said quietly, "a feller oughtn't to have to shoot his own horse when there's others around that can do it as well." And without another word, he led the bleeding horse 100 yards away and shot him. He came back carrying the saddle. Newt was very grateful. He knew he would have had a hard time shooting Mouse. "I wish now we'd never traded," Ben Rainey said. "I never thought anything would happen." That night there was much discussion of the dangers of handling cattle. Everyone agreed there were dangers, but no one had ever heard of a small cow hooking a horse under the girth before and killing it. Newt traded shifts with the Irishman, and then traded again with his replacement 4 hours later. He wanted to be in the dark, where people couldn't see him cry. Mouse had never behaved like other horses, and now he had even found a unique way to die. Newt had had him for 8 years, and felt his loss so keenly that for the first time on the drive he wished it wouldn't get light so soon. But the sun came up beautifully, and he knew he would have to go in to breakfast. He rubbed the tear streaks off his face as best he could, and was about to head for the wagon when he saw Mr. Gus standing outside his little tent, waving at him. Newt rode over. As he passed the open flap of the tent, he saw Lorena sitting on a pallet just inside. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked very beautiful. Augustus had made a fire of buffalo chips and was complaining about it. "Dern, I hate to cook with shit," he said. "I hear you lost your pony." "Yes, Ben was riding him. It wasn't his fault, though," Newt said. "Get down and drink a cup of coffee to cut the grief," Augustus said. As he was drinking the coffee, Lorena came out of the tent. To Newt's surprise, she smiled at him. She didn't say anything, but she smiled. It was such a joy that he immediately started feeling better. All the way from Texas, he had been worrying secretly that Lorena would blame him for her kidnap. After all, he had been supposed to watch her the night she got taken. But she obviously bore him no grudge. She stood in front of the tent, looking at the beautiful morning. "I've got so I like this looking far," she said. Augustus handed her a cup of coffee, and she held it in both hands, the smoke drifting in front of her face. Newt was sure he had never seen anyone as beautiful as her. That he was getting to share breakfast with her was like a miracle. Dish or any other of the boys would give their spurs and saddles to be doing what he was doing. She sat down in front of the tent and blew on her coffee until it was cool enough to drink. Newt drank his and felt a lot better. Poor Mouse was lost, but it was a wonderful day, and he was enjoying the rare privilege of having breakfast with Mr. Gus and Lorena. Across the plain, they could see the herd strung out to the north. The wagon and the remuda were a mile behind them. Po Campo, a tiny dot on the plain, walked well behind the wagon. "That old cook is a sight," Augustus said. "I guess he plans to walk all the way to Canada." "He likes to watch the grass," Newt explained. "He's always finding stuff. He'll cook most anything he picks up." "Does he cook grass?" Lorena asked, interested. She had never seen Po Campo close up, but was intrigued by the sight of the tiny figure walking day after day across the great plain. "No, but he cooks things like grasshoppers once in a while," Newt said. Lorena laughed, a delightful sound to Newt. As she blew on her coffee, she looked at Gus. She had spent many hours looking at him since he had rescued her. It was comfortable traveling with him, for he never got angry or scolded her as other men had. In the weeks when she trembled and cried, he had expressed no impatience and made no demands. She had become so used to him that she had begun to hope the trip would last longer. It had become simple and even pleasant for her. No one bothered her at all, and it was nice to ride along in the early summer sun, looking at the miles and miles of waving grass. Gus talked and talked. Some of what he said was interesting, and some of it wasn't, but it was reassuring that he liked to talk to her. It was enough of a life, and better than any she had had before. But she could not forget the other woman Gus had mentioned. The other woman was the one thing he didn't talk about. She didn't ask, of course, but she couldn't forget either. She dreaded the day when they would come to the town where the other woman lived, for then the simple life might end. It wouldn't, if she could help it, though. She meant to fight for it. She had decided to tell Gus she would marry him before they got to the town. Never before had she given any thought to marrying a man. It had not seemed a likely thing. She had had enough of the kind of men who came into the saloons. Some of them wanted to marry her, of course, young cowboys mostly, but she didn't take that seriously. Gus was different. He had never said he wanted to marry her, but he was handier than most at complimenting her on her beauty. He complimented her still, almost every day, telling her she was the most beautiful woman on the plains. They got along well. They didn't quarrel. To her, it all said that he might want to marry her when they stopped. She was glad he had waved the boy over for breakfast. The boy was harmless, even rather sweet and likable. If she was friendly to the boy, it might make Gus think better of her as a wife-to-be, though he had still not approached her. She felt him stirring when they slept close at night, and she meant to see that he did approach her before they got to Ogallala. She meant to do what she could to make him forget the other woman. When Newt rode back to the herd, he practically floated over the ground. He felt so happy. The death of Mouse was forgotten in the pleasure of remembering Lorena. She had smiled at him as he was mounting to leave. It was not lost on the cowboys that Newt had secured a rare invitation. As he loped back to the drags, many heads were turned his way. But the drive had started, and no one got much of a chance to question him until that evening, when they were all getting their grub. Dish, the friend who had relieved him of the burden of killing his own horse, was the most curious. "Did you get to see Laurie?" Dish asked point blank. He still felt such love for Laurie that even speaking her name caused him to feel weak sometimes. "I seen her. She was drinking coffee," Newt said. "Yes, she always took coffee in the morning," Lippy said, demonstrating a familiarity with Lorena's habits that offended Dish at once. "Yes, and I'm sure you spied on her every opportunity you got," he said hotly. "It didn't take no spying. She took it right in the saloon," Lippy said. "It was watch her go blind." He was aware, as all the hands were, that Dish was mighty in love. But Dish was not the first cowboy to fall in love with a whore, and Lippy didn't feel he had to make too many concessions to the situation. "Dish don't allow low types like us the right even to look at the girl," Jasper remarked. He had met with nothing but rejection at the hands of Lorena, and was still bitter about it. "I bet Newt got a good look," Soupy said. "Newt's getting to an age to have an eye for the damsels." Newt kept silent, embarrassed. He would have liked to brag a little about his visit, perhaps even repeat one of the remarks Lorena had made, but he was aware that he couldn't do so without causing Dish Boggett to feel bad that it wasn't him who had got the visit. "Is Laurie still pretty, or has all this traveling ruined her looks?" Needle Nelson asked. "As if it could," Dish said angrily. "She's real pretty still," Newt said. "Mr. Gus did most of the talking." "Oh, Gus always does the most of it," P.I. said. "If they'd just pitched their tent a little closer, we could all hear it. Gus has a loud voice." "I wouldn't care to listen," Dish said. It rankled him continually that Gus had all of Lorena's company, day after day. "I never seen such a jealous bug as you are, Dish," Jasper said. Call had eaten quickly and left with Dietz. The Arkansas was only a few miles away, and he wanted to have a look at the crossing. They loped up to the river through the long prairie dusk and sat on the riverbank a while. Even in the moonlight, they could see that the current was strong. "I've always heard the Arkansas was swift," Call said. "Did you try it?" "Oh, yes," Dietz said. "It took me down a ways." "It comes out of the same mountains as the Rio Grande," Call said, "just a different side." "Reckon we'll ever get back, Captain?" Dietz asked. He had not planned to ask, but at the mention of the Rio Grande, he felt a sudden homesickness. He had been back and forth across the Rio Grande for so many years that it made him sad to think he might never see it again. The Rio Grande was shallow and warm, and no trouble to cross, whereas the farther north they went, the colder and swifter the rivers became. Call was surprised by the question. "Why, some of the boys will be going back, I guess," he said. "I doubt that I'll return myself," he added, and hoped that Dietz wouldn't want to go either. He relied on Dietz too much. None of the other hands had his judgment. Dietz said no more about it, but his heart was heavy with a longing for Texas. Call looked up the river toward Colorado. "That darn bandit's up there somewhere," he said. "I wish Gus had got him." Dietz could tell by the grim way the captain was looking toward the mountains that he wished he could go after the man. Pursuit was what he and the captain did best, and now he was wishing he could pursue Blue Duck. Thinking to turn the captain's mind from the outlaw, Dietz mentioned something he had considered keeping to himself. It was something he had noticed the day before while scouting to the east a few miles. "Wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Jake is around," he said. "Jake?" Call asked. "Why would he be around?" "Might not be him, but his horse is around," Dietz said. "I crossed the track yesterday. It was that Payson horse he come home on." "I'll swear," Call said. "Are you sure about the horse?" "Oh, yes," Dietz said. "I know the track. 4 other horses with him. I guess Mr. Jake could have sold the horse." "I doubt he would," Call said. "Jake likes a pacer." He thought the information over as they trotted back toward the herd. He had meant it when he told Gus he wanted no more to do with Jake Spoon. Jake had only come back to Lonesome Dove to use them for support, and no doubt he would try to do it again if he got in trouble. This time it would probably be worse trouble, too. Once a man like Jake, who had got by on dash and little else all his life, started sliding, he might slide faster and faster. "Oh, well," Call said, "we ain't far from Dodge. He may just be looking for a summer of gambling. Keep your eye out, though," he added. "If you strike his track again, let me know." Dietz went on back to camp, but Call stopped a mile away and staked his mare. He considered riding over to see Gus and passing on the news, but he decided it could wait until morning. News of Jake might disturb the girl. If he was right and Jake was just headed for Dodge, there was nothing to worry about. He sat up much of the night listening to the Irishman sing to the cattle. As he was listening, a skunk walked between him and the mare. It nosed along, stopping now and then to scratch at the dirt. Call sat still, and the skunk soon went on its way. The hell-bitch paid it no mind. She went on quietly grazing. Chapter 71. "I'll be glad to get to Dodge," Jake said. "I'd like a bath and a whore, and a good barber to shave me. There's a barber there named Sandy that I fancy, if nobody ain't shot him." "You'll know tomorrow, I guess," Dan Suggs said. "I've never liked barbers myself." "Dan don't even like whores," Roy Suggs said. "Dan's hard to please." Jake was cheered by the thought that Dodge was so close. He was tired of the empty prairie and the sullen Suggses, and he was looking forward to jolly company and some good card games. He had every intention of wiggling loose from the Suggses in Dodge. Gambling might be his ticket. He could win a lot of money and tell them he'd had enough of the roving life. They didn't own him, after all. It was a sunny day, and Jake rode along happily. Sometimes he got a lucky feeling, the feeling that he was meant for riches and beautiful women, and that nothing could keep him down for long. The lucky feeling came to him as he rode, and the main part of it was his sense that he was about to get free of the Suggs brothers. They were hard men, and he had made a bad choice in riding with them, but nothing very terrible had come of it, and they were almost to Dodge. It seemed to him he had slid into bad luck in Arkansas the day he accidentally shot the dentist, and now he was about to slide out of it in Kansas and resume the kind of enjoyable life he felt he deserved. Froglip was riding just in front of him, and he felt how nice it would be not to have to consort with such a man again. Froglip rode along silently, as he had the whole trip, but there was menace in his silence, and Jake was ready for lighter company, a whore particularly. There were sure to be plenty of them in Dodge. In the afternoon, though, Dan Suggs, the man who was hard to please, saw something he liked. A herd of about 25 horses being driven south by 3 men. He rode over to the ridge and inspected the horses through his spyglasses. When he came back, he had a pleased look on his face. At the sight of it, Jake immediately lost his lucky feeling. "It's old Will Barger," Dan said. "He's just got 2 hands with him." "Why, I've heard of him," Jake said. "We returned some of his horses to him out of Mexico. Pedro Flores had them. I never met Will Barger myself." "I've met him, the son of a bitch," Dan said. "I rode for him once." "Where's he going with them horses? Back to Texas?" Roy asked. "He's probably sold his lead herd in Dodge and has got another bunch or 2 headed for Denver. He's taken his boys some fresh mounts." Will Barger and his horses were soon out of sight, but Dan Suggs made no move to resume the trip to Dodge. "I guess Dan's feeling bloody," Roy said, observing his brother. "I thought Will Barger was rough," little Eddie said. "He is, but so am I," Dan Suggs said. "I never liked the man. I see no reason why we shouldn't have them horses." Roy Suggs was not greatly pleased by his brother's behavior. "Have 'em and do what with 'em?" he asked. "We can't sell 'em in Dodge if Will Barger's just been there." "Dodge ain't the only town in Kansas," Dan said. "We can sell 'em in Abilene." With no further discussion, he turned and rode southwest at a slow trot. His brothers followed. Jake sat for a moment, his lucky feeling gone, and a sense of dread in its place. He thought maybe the Suggs brothers would forget him and he could ride on to Dodge, but then he saw Froglip looking at him. The black man was impassive. "You coming?" he asked, the first time on the whole trip that he had spoken to Jake directly. There was an insolence in his voice that caused Jake to flare up for a moment, despite himself. "I guess if you watch, you'll find out," Jake said, bitter that the man would address him so. Froglip just looked at him, neither smiling nor frowning. The insolence of the look was so great that for a moment Jake contemplated gunplay. He wanted to shoot the look off the black man's face, but instead he touched his horse lightly with the spurs and followed the Suggs brothers across the plain. He felt angry. The barber and the whore he had been looking forward to had been put off. Soon he heard the black man's horse fall in behind him. Dan Suggs traveled at a leisurely pace. They didn't see Will Barger or his horses again that day. When they spotted a spring with a few low trees growing by it, Dan even stopped for a nap. "You don't want to steal horses in the daytime," he remarked when he awoke. "It works better at night. That way you can put it off on Indians if you're lucky." "We better pull the shoes off these horses, then," Roy Suggs said. "Indians don't use horseshoes much." "You're a stickler for details, ain't you?" Dan said. "Who's gonna track us?" He lay back in the shade and put his hat over his eyes. "Will Barger might if he's so rough," little Eddie said. Dan Suggs just chuckled. "Hell, I thought we come up here to rob banks and regulate settlers," Jake said. "I don't remember hiring on to steal horses. Stealing horses is a hanging crime, as I recall." "I never seen such a bunch of young ladies," Dan said. "Everything's a hanging crime up here in Kansas. They ain't got around to making too many laws." "That may be," Jake said. "Horse stealing don't happen to be my line of work." "You're young. You can learn a new line of work," Dan said, raising up on an elbow. "And if you'd rather not learn, we can leave you up here dead on the ground. I won't tolerate a shirker." With that, he put his hat back over his face and went to sleep. Jake knew he was trapped. He could not fight 4 men. The Suggs brothers all took naps, but Froglip sat by the spring all afternoon cleaning his guns. Late in the afternoon, Dan Suggs got up and took a piss by the spring. Then he lay down on his belly and had a long drink of water. When he got up, he mounted his horse and rode off without a word to anyone. His brothers quickly mounted and followed him, and Jake had no choice but to do the same. Froglip, as usual, brought up the rear. "Dan's feeling real bloody," little Eddie said. "Well, he gets that way," Roy said. "I hope you don't expect me to preach him a sermon." "He don't want them horses," little Eddie said. "He wants to kill that man." "I doubt he'll turn down free horses once he has them," Roy said. Jake felt bitter that the day had turned so bad. It was his bad luck again. He couldn't seem to beat it. If Will Barger had been traveling even half a mile further west, they would never have seen him and his horses, and they would be in Dodge enjoying the comforts of the town. On that vast plain, spotting 3 men and some horses was a mere accident, as much a matter of luck as the bullet that killed Benny Johnson. Yet both had happened. It was enough to make a man a pessimist that such things had started occurring regularly. They soon struck Will Barger's trail and followed it west through the sunset and the long dusk. The trail led northwest toward the Arkansas, easy to follow even in the twilight. Dan Suggs never slowed. They struck the river and swam it by moonlight. Jake hated to ride sopping wet, but was offered no choice, for Dan Suggs didn't pause. Nobody said a word when they came to the river. Nobody said one afterward. The moon was well over in the west before Dan Suggs drew rein. "Go find them, Frog," he said. "I doubt they're far." "Do I shoot or not?" the black man asked. "Hell no, don't shoot," Dan said. "Do you think I'd ride all this way and swim a river just to miss the fun? Come on back when you find them." Froglip was back in a few minutes. "We nearly rode into them," he said. "They are close." Dan Suggs had been smoking, but he quickly put his smoke out and dismounted. "You hold the horses," he said to little Eddie. "Come on once you hear the shooting." "I can shoot as good as Roy," little Eddie protested. "Hell, Roy couldn't hit his foot if it was nailed to a tree," Dan said. "Anyway, we're going to let Jake shoot them. He's the man with the reputation." He took the rifle and walked off. Jake and the others followed. There was no sign of a campfire, no sign of anything but plains and darkness. Though Froglip had said the men were close, it seemed to Jake they walked a long time. He didn't see the horses until he almost bumped into one. For a moment he thought of trying to grab a horse and run away bareback. The commotion would warn Will Barger, and maybe one or two of the Suggs boys would get shot. But the horse quickly stepped away from him, and the moment passed. He drew his pistol, not knowing what else to do. They had found the horses, but he didn't know where the camp was. Froglip was near him, watching, Jake supposed. When the first shot came, he didn't know who fired it, though he saw a flash from a rifle barrel. It seemed so far away that he almost felt it must be another battle. Then gunfire flared just in front of him, too much to be produced by 3 men, it seemed. So much shooting panicked him for a second, and he fired twice into the darkness, with no idea of what he might be shooting at. He heard gunfire behind him. It was Froglip shooting. He began to sense running figures, although it was not clear to him who they were. Then there were 5 or 6 shots close together like sudden thunder, and the sound of a running horse. Jake could see almost nothing. Once in a while he would think he saw a man, but he couldn't be sure. "Frog, did you get him?" he heard Dan Suggs ask. "No, he got me, damn him," he heard the black man say. "I swear I put 3 into him, but he made it to that horse anyway," Dan said. "You alive, Roy?" "I'm alive," Roy Suggs said from back near the horse herd. "Well, what are you doing over there?" Dan wanted to know. "The damn fight was over here." "We want the horses, don't we?" Roy asked, anger in his voice. "I wanted that goddamn Will Barger worse," Dan said. "What about you, Spoon?" "Not hurt," Jake said. "Hell, you and Roy might as well have stayed in Dodge for all the good you are in the dark," Dan said. Jake didn't answer. He was just glad he had not been forced to shoot anybody. It seemed ridiculous attacking men in the dark. Even Indians waited until sunup. He took some hope from the fact that Froglip claimed to have been hit, though how anybody knew where to shoot was a mystery to him. "Where's that goddamn kid?" Dan asked. "I told him to bring them horses. Old Will Barger's getting away. Where'd you get hit, Frog?" Froglip didn't answer. "God damn the old son of a bitch," Dan said. "I guess he's killed Frog. Go get Eddie, Roy." "You told him to come. I guess he'll come," Roy said. "You best go get him unless you think you're bulletproof," Dan said in a deadly voice. "I ain't going if Will Barger's out there," Roy said. "You won't shoot me neither. I'm your brother." There were 2 more shots, so close that Jake jumped. "Did I get you?" Dan asked. "No, and don't shoot no more," Roy said in a surprised voice. "Why would you shoot at me?" "There ain't nobody else around to shoot at except Jake, and you know his reputation," Dan said sarcastically. They heard horses coming. "Boys?" little Eddie called out. "No, mostly girls here tonight," Dan said. "Are you waiting for election day or what? Bring the goddamn horses." Little Eddie brought them. The dawn was behind him, very faint but coming. Soon it was possible to make out the results of the battle. Will Barger's 2 men were dead, still in their blankets. One was Chick, the little weasel Jake remembered seeing the morning they brought the horses in from Mexico. He had been hit in the neck by a rifle bullet, Froglip's, Dan said. The bullet had practically torn his head loose from his body. The corpse reminded Jake of a dead rabbit, perhaps because Chick had rabbit-like teeth, exposed now in a stiff grimace. The other dead man was just a boy, probably Will Barger's wrangler. Of Will Barger himself there was no sign. "I know I put 3 into him," Dan Suggs said. "He must have slept with the damn reins in his hand, or he'd have never got to his horse." Froglip lay on the ground, still gripping his rifle. His eyes were wide open, and he was breathing as heavily as a horse after a long run. His wound was in the groin. His pants were wet with blood. The rising sun shone in his face, which was beaded with sweat. "Who shot Frog?" little Eddie asked in surprise. "Why, that damn Will Barger. Who else?" Dan said. He had no more than glanced at Froglip. He was scanning the plains with his spyglass, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cowman. But the plains were empty. "I never thought anybody would get Frog," little Eddie said, unnerved by what he saw. Dan Suggs was snarling with frustration. He glared at his brothers as if they were solely responsible for Will Barger's escape. "You boys ought to go home and teach school," he said. "It's all you're good for." "What did you expect me to do?" Roy asked. "I can't see in the dark." Dan walked over and looked down at Froglip. He ignored his brothers. He knelt down and pulled the Negro's blood-stained shirt loose from his pants, exposing the wound. After a second, he stood up. "Frog, I guess this was your unlucky day," he said. "I guess we better just shoot you." Froglip didn't answer. He didn't move or even blink his eyes. "Shoot him and let's go," Dan said, looking at little Eddie. "Shoot Frog?" little Eddie said, as if he had not heard quite right. "Yes, Frog's the one with the slug in his gut," Dan said. "He's the one that needs to finish up dying. Shoot him and let's ride." "I hate to shoot Frog," little Eddie said in a dazed tone. "I guess we'll just leave him for the buzzards, then, if you're so squeamish," Dan said. He removed the rifle from the Negro's hand and took the big pistol out of his belt. "Ain't you going to let him keep his guns?" Roy asked. "Nope," Dan said. "He won't need 'em, but we might." With that he mounted and rode over to look at the horse herd they had captured. "You shoot him, Roy," little Eddie said. "I hate to." "No, Dan's mad at me anyway," Roy said. "If I do something he ordered you to do, I'll be the one shot." With that he mounted and rode off too. Jake walked over to his horse, feeling that it had been a black day when he met the Suggses. "Would you like to shoot him, Jake?" little Eddie said. "I've known him all my life." "I wouldn't care to," Jake said. He remembered how insolent Froglip had been only the day before, and how he had wanted to shoot him then. It had been a rapid turnabout. The man lay on the ground, dying of a cruel wound, and none of the men he rode with even wanted to put him out of his misery. "Well, damn," little Eddie said. "Nobody's much help." He shrugged, drew his gun, and without another word walked over and shot Froglip in the head. The body jerked, and that was that. "Get his money," Dan Suggs yelled. "I forgot to." Little Eddie went through the dead man's bloody pockets before he mounted. Jake had supposed they might try to go after Will Barger since he was wounded, but Dan Suggs turned the horse herd north. "Ain't we going after that man?" Roy asked. "I couldn't track an elephant, and neither could you," Dan said. "Frog was our tracker. I shot Will Barger 3 times. I expect he'll die." "I thought we was going to Abilene," little Eddie said. "Abilene ain't this way." Dan sneered at his brother. "I wish Will Barger had shot you instead of Frog," he said. "Frog was a damn sight better hand." Jake thought maybe he had seen the last of the killing. He felt it could be worse. The shooting had all been in pitch darkness. Will Barger hadn't seen him. He couldn't be connected with the raid. It was luck of a sort. If he could just get free of the Suggses, he wouldn't be in such hopeless trouble. As he rode along, trailing the 25 horses, he decided the best thing for him would be to leave the West. He could travel over to St. Louis and catch a boat down to New Orleans, or even go east to New York. Both of them were fine towns for gamblers, or so he had heard. In either one, he could be safe and could pursue the kind of life he enjoyed. Looking back on it, it seemed to him that he had been remarkably lucky to survive as long as he had in such a rough place, where killing was an everyday affair. No man's luck lasted forever, and the very fact that he had fallen in with the Suggses suggested that his was about exhausted. He resolved to bend his wits to getting out while the getting was possible. The death of Froglip made the task easier, for, as Dan said, Froglip was the only tracker in the crowd. If he could just manage to get a good jump somehow, he might get away. And if he did, he wouldn't stop until he hit the Mississippi. With his mind made up, he felt cheerful. It always gave a man a lift to escape death. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and he was alive to see it. With any luck at all, he had seen the end of the trouble. His good mood lasted 2 hours, and then something occurred which turned it sour. It seemed as if the world was deserted except for them and the horses, and then, to his surprise, he saw a tent. It was staked under a single tree directly ahead of them. Near the tent, 2 men were plowing with 4 mules. Dan Suggs was riding ahead of the horse herd, and Jake saw him lope off toward the settlers. He didn't think much about it. He was watching the tent to see if any women were around. Then he heard the faint pop of a shot and looked up to see one of the settlers fall. The other man was standing there, no gun in his hand, nothing. He stood as if paralyzed, and in a second Dan Suggs shot him too. Then he trotted over to the tent, got off his horse, and went inside. Jake hardly knew what to think. He had just seen 2 men shot in the space of seconds. He had no idea why. By the time he got near the tent, Dan Suggs had drug a little trunk outside and was rifling it. He pitched the clothes which were in the trunk out on the grass. His brothers rode over to join the fun, and were soon holding up various garments to see if they fit. Jake rode over too, feeling nervous. Dan Suggs was clearly in a killing mood. Both farmers lay dead on the grass near their mule team, which was quietly grazing. Both had bullet holes in their foreheads. Dan had shot them at point-blank range. "Well, they didn't have much but a watch," Dan said, holding up a fine-looking silver pocket watch. "I guess I'll take the watch." His brothers found nothing of comparable value, although they searched the tent thoroughly. While they were looking, Dan started a fire with some coal oil he had found and made some coffee. "I tell you, let's hang 'em," he said, strolling over to look at the dead men. Both were in their 40s, both had scraggly beards. Roy Suggs looked puzzled. "Why would you want to hang 'em?" he asked. "They're already dead." "I know, but it's a shame to waste that tree," Dan said. "It's the only tree around. What's a tree good for if not to hang somebody from?" The thought made little Eddie giggle, a nervous giggle. "Dan, you beat all," he said. "I never heard of hanging dead men." Nonetheless, Dan meant it. He put ropes around both the dead men's necks and had his brothers drag them to the tree and hoist them up. It was not a large tree, and the dead men's feet were only a few inches off the ground. Jake was not called on to help, and he didn't. When the men were hung, twisting at the end of the ropes, Dan Suggs stood back to study the effect and evidently didn't like it. His brothers were watching him nervously. It was plain from his face that he was still in an angry mood. "These goddamn sodbusters," he said. "I hate their guts and livers." "Well, that's fine, Dan," Roy said. "They're dead enough." "No, they ain't," Dan said. "A goddamn sodbuster can never be dead enough to suit me." With that he went over and got the can of coal oil he had used to start the fire. He began to splash it on the hanged men's clothes. "What's that for?" little Eddie asked. "You've already shot 'em and hung 'em." "Yes, and now I intend to burn them," Dan said. "Any objections from you school teachers?" He looked at all 3 of them, challenge in his angry eyes. No one said a word. Jake felt sickened by what was happening, but he didn't try to stop it. Dan Suggs was crazy, there was no doubt of that, but his craziness didn't affect his aim. The only way to stop him would be to kill him, a risky business in broad daylight. Little Eddie giggled his nervous giggle again as he watched his brother set the dead men's clothes on fire. Even with the coal oil, it wasn't easy. Dan had to splash them several times before he got their clothes wet enough to blaze. But finally he did, and the clothes flared up. It was a terrible sight. Jake thought he wouldn't look, but despite himself he did. The men's sweaty clothes were burned right off them, and their scraggly beards seared. A few rags of clothes fell off beneath their feet. The men's pants burned off, leaving their belts and a few shreds of cloth around their waists. "Dan, you beat all," little Eddie repeated several times. He giggled often. He was unnerved. Roy Suggs methodically tore the tent apart and poked through all the men's meager belongings, hoping to find valuables. "They didn't have nothing," he said. "I don't know why you even bothered to kill them." "It was their unlucky day, same as it was Frog's," Dan said. "We'll miss Frog. The man could shoot. I wish I had that damn Will Barger here. I'd cook him good." After drinking some more coffee, Dan Suggs mounted up. The 2 farmers, the trunks of their bodies blackened, still hung from the tree. "Don't you intend to bury them?" Jake asked. Somebody's going to find them, you know, and it could be the law. Dan Suggs just laughed. I'd like to see the law that could take me, he said. No man in Kansas could manage it, and anyway I fancy seeing Nebraska. He turned to his brothers, who were dispiritedly raking through the settlers' clothes, still hoping to find something worth taking. Get them mules, boys, Dan said. No sense in leaving good mules. With that he rode off. He's bloody today, Roy said, going over to the mules. If we run into any more sodbusters, it's too bad for them. Jake's happy mood was gone, though the day was as sunny as ever. It was clear to him that his only hope was to escape the Suggses as soon as possible. Dan Suggs could wake up feeling bloody any day, and the next time there might be no sodbusters around to absorb his fury, in which case things could turn really grim. He trotted along all day, well back from the horse herd, trying to forget the two blackened bodies whose shoes had still been smoldering when they left. Chapter 72. Dietz found Will Barger by backtracking his horse. The horse, with dried blood on the saddle and crusted in its mane, was waiting for them on the north bank of the Arkansas. Several times, as they were bringing the cattle to the crossing, the horse started to swim over to them, but turned back. Dietz crossed first, ahead of Old Dog, and recognized the horse even before he hit the bank. It was the big bay Will Barger had ridden into Lonesome Dove several months before. He rode up and caught the horse easily, but then what looked to be a simple cattle crossing turned out to be anything but simple. Dish Boggett's horse, which had crossed many rivers calmly and easily, took fright in midstream and very nearly drowned Dish. The horse went crazy in the water, and if Dish hadn't been a strong swimmer, would have pawed him under. Even then it might have happened, if Dietz had not dashed back into the water and fought the horse off long enough for Dish to get ashore. The trouble opened a gap in the line of cowboys, and some 300 cattle veered off and began to swim straight downstream. The line of cattle broke, and in no time there were pockets of cattle here and there, swimming down the Arkansas, paying no attention to the riders who tried to turn them. Newt got caught beside such a bunch, and after swimming 200 yards downstream with them, ended up on the same bank he had started out on. Eventually, the herd split into 5 or 6 groups. Augustus came over to help, but there was not much he could do. Most of the cattle went back to the south bank, but quite a few swam far downstream. "Looks like your herd's floating away, Woodrow," Augustus said. "I know. I'm surprised that it ain't hailing or shooting lightning bolts at us," Call said. Though the scattering was annoying, he was not seriously disturbed, for the river was fairly shallow, and the banks rather low where they were crossing. It would only take a little more time to restart the cattle that had gone back to the south bank. Fortunately, no cattle were bogged, and this time no cowboys drowned. "Good Lord," Augustus said as Dietz came up leading the bay. "Where's Mr. Will Barger that he could afford to let his horse run loose?" "Dead, I fear," Call said. "Look at the blood on that horse's mane." "Hell, I liked Will Barger," Augustus said. "I'd be right sorry if he's dead. I'll go have a look." "Who'll watch the girl while you're gone?" Call asked. Augustus stopped. "You're right," he said. "It might make her uneasy if I just ride off. Maybe Dietz better go have the look." "It could be Indians, you know," Call said. "I think you better move her a little closer to the wagon." Dietz didn't come back until mid-afternoon, by which time the herd was a few miles north of the Arkansas. "I doubt cattle is ever at this grass," Augustus said. "I doubt anyone's trailed cattle this far west of Dodge. Buffalo is probably all that's at it." Call's mind was on Will Barger, a resourceful man, if ever he had seen one. If such a man had got caught, then there could well be serious trouble waiting for them. "You're supposed to be able to smell Indians," he said to Augustus. "Do you smell any?" "No," Augustus said. "I just smell a lot of cow shit. I expect my smeller will be ruined forever before this trip is over by smelling so much cow shit." "It don't mention buffalo in the Bible," Augustus remarked. "Well, why should it?" Call said. "It might be that a buffalo is a kind of ox, only browner," Augustus said. Ox are mentioned in the Bible. What got you on the Bible? Call asked. Boredom, Augustus said. Religious controversy is better than none. If there's mad Indians around, you may get more controversy than you bargained for, Call said. Lorena heard the remark. She was riding behind them. Mention of Indians brought back memories and made her nervous. Finally, they saw Dietz coming along the river from the southeast. It was clear from the dried sweat on his horse that he had ridden hard. They didn't get Dietz, whoever they are, Augustus said. I found the man, Dietz said, drawing rein. He's shot. Dead? Call asked. Dying, I expect, Dietz said. I couldn't move him. He's hit 3 times. How far away? About 10 miles, Dietz said. I got him propped up, but I couldn't bring him. Did he say much? Augustus asked. He wants to see you if you're not too busy, Dietz said. He said if you were busy, don't make the trip. Why would I be that busy? Augustus asked. Dietz looked at him. He's real polite, that gentleman, he said. I guess he thinks he might be dead before you get there. Oh, I see. The man don't want to put nobody out, Augustus said. I'll go anyway. I admire his conversation. Change horses, Call said to Dietz, and Dietz loped off. He was trying to decide who they ought to take, and finally decided just to take P.I., Dietz, and the boy. The boy could watch the horses if there was trouble. It meant leaving the herd, but there was no help for it. There was good grazing, and the herd looked peaceful. Dish and the rest of the crew ought to be able to handle it. Was it Indians got him? He asked when Dietz returned. Dietz shook his head. White men, he said. Horse thieves. Oh, Call said. Murdering horse thieves at that. But it relieved his mind, for horse thieves wouldn't attack an outfit as large as theirs. Augustus dropped back to explain matters to Lorena. She looked at him with worry in her eyes. Now, Laurie, you relax, he said. It wasn't Indians after all. What was it then? She asked. The man who loaned us this tent got shot, he said. He's in a bad way, it appears. We're going to see if we can help him. How long will it take? Lorena asked. It was already late afternoon. It meant a night without Gus, and she had not had to face one since he rescued her. I don't know, honey, he said. A few days, maybe, if we go after the horse thieves that shot him. If there's a chance to get them, we'll try. Call won't let a horse thief off, and he's right. I'll go, Lorena said. I can keep up. We don't need the tent. No, Augustus said. You stay with the wagon. You'll be perfectly safe. I'll ask Dish to look after you. Lorena began to shake. Maybe Gus was doing it because he was tired of her. Maybe he would never come back. He might slip off and find the woman in Nebraska. To her surprise, Gus read her mind. He smiled his devilish smile at her. I ain't running for the bushes, if that's what you think, he said. There ain't no bushes, she pointed out. I just don't want you to go, Gus. I got to, Augustus said. A man's dying, and he asked for me. We're kind of friends. And think what would have happened when the grasshoppers hit if we hadn't had this tent to hide in. I'll be back, and I'll see that Dish looks after you in the meantime. Why him? She asked. I don't need him. Just tell him to leave me be. Dish is the best hand, Augustus said. Just because he's in love with you don't mean he couldn't be helpful if a storm blew up or something. It ain't his fault he's in love with you. He's smitten, and that's all there is to it. I don't care about him, Lorena said. I want you to come back. I will, honey, he said, checking the loads in his rifle. Dish could hardly believe his luck when Augustus told him to take Lorena her meals and look after her. The thought that he would be allowed to go over to the tent made him a little dizzy. Do you think she'll speak to me? He asked, looking at the tent. Lorena had gone inside and pulled the flaps, though it was hot. Not today, Augustus said. Today she's feeling sulky. If I was you, I'd sing to her. Sing to Laurie? Dish said, incredulous. Why, I'd be so scared I'd choke. Well, if you require timid women, there's not much I can do for you, Augustus said. Just keep a good guard at night and see she don't get kidnapped. Call hated to leave the herd, and most of the cowboys hated it that he was leaving. Though it was midsummer, the skies clear, and the plains seemingly peaceful, most of the hands looked worried as the little group prepared to leave. They sat around worrying, all but Pocampo, who was singing quietly in his raspy voice as he made supper. Even Lippy was unnerved. He was modest in some matters, and had just returned from walking a mile in order to relieve his bowels in private. "If you see any bushes, bring one back with you," he said to the mounted men. "If we had a bush or two, I wouldn't have to walk so far just to do my business." "I don't know why you're so modest," Augustus said. "Go over and squat behind a cow. You got a hole in your stomach anyway." "I wish we'd brought the pianner," Lippy said. "A little pianner music would go good right now." Call put Dish in charge of the outfit, meaning that he suddenly had two heavy responsibilities, Lorena and the herd. It left him subdued just thinking about it. If anything should happen to the girl or the herd, he'd never be able to hold up his head again. "Ease 'em along," Call told Dish. "Bert can scout ahead and make sure there's water." If Dish felt subdued, Newt felt nothing but pride to have been selected for the trip. He could tell some of the other hands were envious, particularly the Rainey boys, but it was the captain's order, and no one dared say a word. When he saw the captain put 2 boxes of rifle shells into his saddlebag, he felt even prouder, for it meant he might be expected to fight. The captain must have decided he was grown to bring him on such a trip. After all, only the original Hat Creek outfit, the captain and Mr. Gus, P. and Dietz were going along, and now he was included. Every few minutes as they rode east, he put his hand on his pistol to reassure himself that it was still there. They got back to Wilbarger a little after sundown, before the plains had begun to lose the long twilight. He had reached the Arkansas before collapsing, and lay under the shade of the bank on a blanket Dietz had left him. He was too weak to do more than raise his head when they rode up. Even that exhausted him. "Well, you just keep turning up," he said to Augustus with a wan smile. "I've been lying here trying not to bleed on this good blanket your man left me." Augustus stooped to examine him and saw at once there was no hope. "I've bled so much already I expect I'm white as snow," Wilbarger said. "I'm a darn mess. I took one in the lung, and another seems to have ruined my hip. The third was just a flesh wound." "I don't think we can do anything about the lung," Call said. Wilbarger smiled. "No, and neither could a Boston surgeon," he said. He raised his head again. "Still riding that mare, I see," he said. "If I could have talked you out of her, I probably wouldn't be lying here shot. She'd have smelled the damn horse thieves. I do think she's a beauty." "How many were there?" Call asked, "or could you get a count?" "I expect it was Dan Suggs and his 2 brothers, and a bad nigger they ride with," Wilbarger said. "I think I hit the nigger." "I don't know the Suggses," Call said. "They're well known around Fort Worth for being murdering rascals," Wilbarger said. "I never expected to be fool enough to let them murder me. It's humbling. I lived through the worst war ever fought, and then got killed by a damn sneaking horse thief. That galls me, I tell you." "Any of us can oversleep," Augustus said quietly. "If he was to lie quiet, that lung might heal." "No, sir, not likely," Wilbarger said. "I saw too many lung-shot boys when we were fighting the Rebs to expect that to happen. I'd rather just enjoy a little more conversation." He turned his eyes toward the hell-bitch and smiled. The sight of her seemed to cheer him more than anything. "I do admire that mare," he said. "I want you to keep that mean plug of mine for your troubles. He's not brilliant, but he's sturdy." He lay back and was quiet for a while as the dusk deepened. "I was born on the Hudson, you know," he said a little later. "I fully expected to die on it, but I guess the darn Arkansas will have to do." "I wish you'd stop talking about your own death," Augustus said in a joking tone. "It ain't genteel." Wilbarger looked at him and chuckled, a chuckle that brought up blood. "Why, it's because I ain't genteel that I'm bleeding to death beside the Arkansas," he said. "I could have been a lawyer, like my brother, and be in New York right now eating oysters." He didn't speak again until it was full dark. Newt stood over with the horses, trying not to cry. He had scarcely known Mr. Wilbarger, and had found him blunt at first, but the fact that he was lying there on a bloody blanket, dying so calmly, affected him more than he had thought it would. The emptiness of the plains as they darkened was so immense that affected him too, and a sadness grew in him until tears began to spill from his eyes. Captain McCall and Mr. Gus sat by the dying man. Dietz was on the river bank 100 yards away, keeping watch. And P.I. stood with Newt by the horses, thinking his own thoughts. "How long will it take him to die?" Newt asked, feeling he couldn't bear such a strain for a whole night. "I've seen boys linger for days," P.I. said quietly. He had always thought it impolite to talk about a man's death within his hearing. Gus's joke had shocked him a little. "But then sometimes they just go," he added. "Go when they're ready, or even if they ain't. This man's lost so much blood he might go over pretty soon." Call and Augustus knew there was nothing to do but wait, so they sat beside Wilbarger's pallet, saying little. 2 hours passed with no sound but Wilbarger's faint breathing. Then, to Call's surprise, Wilbarger's hand reached out and clutched him for a moment. "Let's shake, for the favors you've done me," Wilbarger said weakly. When Call had given him a handshake, Wilbarger reached for Augustus, who shook his hand in turn. "McCrae, I'll give you credit for having written a damn amusing sign," he said. "I've laughed about that sign many a time, and laughing's a pleasure. I've got 2 good books in my saddlebags. One's Mr. Milton, and the other's a Virgil. I want you to have them. The Virgil might improve your Latin." "I admit it's rusty," Augustus said. "I'll apply myself, and many thanks." "To tell the truth, I can't read it either," Wilbarger said. "I could once, but I lost it. I just like to look at it on the page. It reminds me of the Hudson and my schooling and all. Now and then I catch a word." He coughed up a lot of blood, and both Call and Augustus thought it was over, but it wasn't. Wilbarger was still breathing, though faintly. Call went over and told P.I. and Newt to start digging the grave. He wanted to get started after the horse thieves as soon as it was light enough to track. Restless, he walked over and helped Dietz keep watch. To Augustus's surprise, Wilbarger raised his head. He had heard the digging. "Your friend's efficient, ain't he?" said. "Efficient," Augustus agreed. "He likes to chase horse thieves, too. Seems like we're always having to get your horses back, Wilbarger. Where do you want 'em delivered this time?" "Oh, hell! Sell 'em," Wilbarger said in shaky tones. "I'm done with the cow business finally. Send the money to my brother, John Wilbarger, 50 Broadway, New York City." He coughed again. "Keep the tent," he said. "How's the shy young lady?" "She's improved," Augustus said. "I wish we'd met sooner, McCrae," Wilbarger said. "I enjoy your conversation. I hope you'll bury my man Chick and that boy that was with us. I wish now I'd never hired that boy." "We'll tend to it," Augustus said. An hour later, Wilbarger was still breathing. Augustus stepped away for a minute to relieve himself, and when he came back, Wilbarger had rolled off the blanket and was dead. Augustus rolled him on his back and tied him in the blanket. Call was down by the river, smoking and waiting. He looked up when Augustus approached. "He's gone," Augustus said. "All right," Call said. "He said he was traveling with a man and a boy," Augustus said. "Let's go then," Call said, standing up. "We won't have to backtrack him. We can just look for the buzzards." Augustus was troubled by the fact that he could find nothing with which to mark Wilbarger's grave. The plains and the river bank were bare. He gave up and came to the grave just as P.I. and Dietz were covering the man with dirt. "If he had a family and they cared to look, they'd never find him," Augustus said. "Well, I can't help it," Call said. "I know something," Dietz said, and to everyone's surprise mounted and loped off. A few minutes later he came loping back with the skull of a cow buffalo. "I seen the bones," he said. "It's better than nothing," Augustus said as he sat the skull on the grave. Of course, it wasn't much better than nothing. A coyote would probably just come along and drag the skull off, and Will Barger, too. Dietz had found Will Barger's rifle and offered it to Augustus. "Give it to Newt," Augustus said. "I got a rifle." Newt took the gun. He had always wanted a rifle, but at the moment he couldn't feel excited. It was such a strain, people always dying. He had a headache and wanted to cry or be sick or go to sleep, he didn't know which. It was such a strain that he almost wished he had been left with the wagon, although being selected to go had been his greatest pride only a few hours before. Augustus, riding beside him, noticed the boy's downcast look. "Feeling poorly?" he asked. Newt didn't know what to say. He was surprised that Mr. Gus had even noticed him. "You've been on too many burying parties," Augustus said. Old Will Barger had a sense of humor. He'd laugh right out loud if he knew he had the skull of a buffalo cow for a grave marker. Probably the only man who ever went to Yale College who was buried under a buffalo skull. How he died hadn't been funny, Newt thought. "It's all right, though," Augustus said. "It's mostly bones we're riding over anyway. Well, think of all the buffalo that have died on these plains. Buffalo and other critters, too. And the Indians have been here forever. Their bones are down there in the earth. I'm told that over in the old country, you can't dig 6 feet without uncovering skulls and leg bones and such. People have been living there since the beginning, and their bones have kind of filled up the ground. It's interesting to think about, all the bones in the ground. But it's just fellow creatures. It's nothing to shy from." It was such a startling thought that under him, beneath the long grass, were millions of bones, that Newt stopped feeling so strained. He rode beside Mr. Gus, thinking about it the rest of the night. Chapter 73. As soon as he had the herd well settled, Dish decided to see if there was anything he could do for Lorena. It had been months since the afternoon in Lonesome Dove when he had got so drunk, and in all that time he had not even spoken to her. He was out of practice, in fact, had never been in practice, though that was not his fault. He would cheerfully have talked to Lorena all day and all night, but she didn't want it, and they had never exchanged more than a few words. His heart was beating hard, and he felt more fearful than if he were about to swim a swift river as he approached her tent. Gus had set up the tent before he left, but it was supper time, so Dish got a plate of beef for Lorena's supper. He took his responsibilities so seriously that he had tried to pick out the best piece, in the process holding up the line and irritating the crew, none of whom were the least impressed with his responsibilities. "That gal don't need beefsteak. She can just eat you if she's hungry, Dish," Jasper said. "I expect you'd make about 3 good bites for a woman like her." Dish flared up at Jasper's insulting tone, but he had the plate in his hand and was in no position to fight. "I'll settle you when I come back, Jasper," he said. "You've provoked me once too often." "Hell, you better run for the border then, Jas," Soupy Jones said. "With a top hand like Dish after you, you won't stand a chance." Dish had to mount holding the plate, which was awkward, but no one offered to help. "Why don't you walk?" Polcampo suggested. "The tent is not very far." That was true, but Dish preferred to ride, which he did, managing not to spill any of Lorena's food. She was sitting just inside the tent with the flaps open. "I'm come with some food," Dish said, still on his horse. "I'm not hungry," Lorena said. "I'll wait till Gus gets back." It seemed to Dish that she was as grudging in her tone as ever. He felt foolish, sitting on a horse holding a plate of beefsteak, so he dismounted. "Gus is after them horse thieves," he said. "He might not be back for a day or 2. I'm supposed to look after you." "Send Newt," Lorena said. "Well, he went too," Dish said. Lorena came out of the tent for a moment and took the plate. Dish was paralyzed to be so close to her after so many months. She went right back into the tent. "You don't need to stay," she said. "I'll be all right." "I'll help you with the tent in the morning," he said. "Captain said we're to ease on north." Lorena didn't answer. She closed the flaps of the tent. Dish walked back toward the campfire, but he stopped about halfway and staked his horse. He didn't want to go back to the camp, even to eat, for he would just have to box Jasper Fant if he did. It was full dusk, but to his irritation, Lippy spotted him and came walking over. "Did you get a good look at her, Dish?" Lippy asked. "Why, yes," Dish said. "I delivered her supper, if you don't mind." "Is she still as beautiful?" Lippy asked, remembering their days together at the Dry Bean, when she had come down toward noon every day. He and Xavier would both wait for her, and would feel better just watching her walk down the stairs. "Why, yes," Dish said, not wanting to discuss it, though at least Lippy had spoken respectfully. "Well, that Gus, he would end up with her," Lippy said. "Gus is too sly for the girls." "I'd like to know what you mean by that," Dish said. "I seen him trick her once," Lippy said, remembering the extraordinary wager he had witnessed. "He offered to cut the cards for a poke, and he won. Then he paid her $50 anyway, and he paid me 10 not to tell Jake. He didn't pay me nothing not to tell you, though, Dish," Lippy added. It occurred to him suddenly that Gus might consider that they had breached their bargain. $50, Dish said, genuinely astonished. He had never heard of such extravagance in his life. "Did he actually pay it?" "Well, he give me the 10, Lippy said. "I imagine he give Laurie the 50, too. Gus ain't cheap. He's just crazy." Dish remembered the night before he had hired on with the Hat Creek outfit, when Gus had lent him $2 for the same purpose on which he had apparently spent 50. There was no figuring the man out. "You oughtn't to blabbed," he told Lippy. "I ain't told nobody else," Lippy said, realizing himself that he shouldn't have blabbed. Lippy soon went back to the wagon, subdued by his own indiscretion, but not before assuring Dish that the story would go no further. Dish unsaddled his horse and got his bedroll. He lay on the blanket all night, his head on his saddle, thinking of Laurie, wondering if his chance with her would ever come. The Kansas sky was thickly seeded with stars. He listened to the Irishmen sing the sad songs that seemed to soothe the cattle. He spent the whole night thinking about the woman in the tent nearby, imagining things that might happen when they finally came to Montana and were through with the trail. He didn't sleep or want to sleep, for there was no telling when he would get a chance to spend another night close to her. His horse grazed nearby on the good grass, which grew wet with dew as the morning came. Dish saddled a little before sunup and rode out to look at the herd, which was perfectly peaceful. Then he went to the wagon, ignoring Jasper and Soupy, who were as insolent as ever. He wanted to teach them both a lesson, but couldn't afford the time. The herd had to be set moving, and somebody would have to hold the point. It was a ticklish problem, for he couldn't hold the point and help Laurie, too. He fixed a plate for Lorena and just grabbed a hunk of bacon for himself. "Why, look at him. He's taken her breakfast," Jasper said. "Dish, you're so good at toting food you ought to work in a hotel."